acknowledge the reality of the fact that our economy is in considerable difficulty. The budget drawn for the 2022 fiscal year was thrown out of gear, disrupting our balance of payments and debt sustainability, and further exposing the structural weaknesses of our economy. We have gone to the International Monetary Fund to repair in the short term our public finances and restore our balance of payments, while we continue to work on the medium to long-term structural changes that are at the heart of our goal of constructing a resilient, robust Ghanaian economy and building a Ghana beyond aid. Just as we managed to achieve a staff-level agreement with the fund in record time in December last year, whose terms we are systematically fulfilling, including the difficult but ultimately highly successful process of the domestic debt exchange program. I'm confident that with the cooperation we are receiving from members of the Paris Club and the People's Republic of China, which has sent a delegation from China's Exim Bank to Accra over the weekend to meet with officials of the Ministry of Finance, we shall be able to go to the board of the fund to conclude finally the agreement by the end of March. This will set the stage for the strong recovery of Ghana's economy. Needless to say, we would hope that all Ghana's friends would weigh in with words of support at the fund.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the government has taken the right steps, has reached out very actively. I don't see anything that anybody else could have done better. It is really at this point of time, it is really the question on how to convince particular China to come to the table. That is the key question right now. Because all the others, I mean, the Paris Club members have agreed; they are ready. But again, they are not willing to lower the request to Ghana, and with this financing the debts of China. I mean, that must be understandable for everybody. So we are ready to negotiate, but only if all the other creditors are willing, are taking up their responsibility in the same way. Basically, as I said, it will be in the framework of existing cooperation, and we might be willing to consider some additional funds to be added. I mentioned the important part of vocational training, because competitiveness is about skilled labor and quality of the workforce, especially if you look at competitiveness in the region. So that's an important part of support. And secondly, it's also about financial access to financing. The World Bank, jointly with the German Development Bank KfW and the African Development Bank, supported Ghana in the setup of the Development Bank of Ghana. For us, this is the key tool for supporting the business sector, and we have supported the build-up of this bank, and we hope that this bank will prove to be very, very helpful for the sector, and we might be willing to look into adding up this financing window for this bank. Well, of course, it depends very much on what kind of expenditures you're looking at, and there are certain. I'm convinced this is true for. If I look at the budget of the German Foreign Ministry, of the German government, I'm convinced there are important parts that can be cut without hurting the economic development. And
Welcome back on the AM show. Now we get into our big stories and we're talking about our external debt. Finance Minister Ken Ofori-Atta has hinted that a planned high-level government delegation to China has been postponed to late March 2023. This is owing to the upcoming National People's Congress of China, a meeting scheduled for early March. However, the finance minister said bilateral talks would continue ahead of this important mission. Government is seeking, under the G20 Common Framework for Debt Treatment, to get debt forgiveness from some bilateral and multilateral partners. We discussed this together with government's quest to seek debt cancellation with our guests, Professor Godfred Bokpin. He's a lecturer at the University of Ghana Business School. Dr. Saad Idrisu is economist, Louisiana Economic Development. We also have other guests joining the conversation. We have Leslie Dwight, Mensa economist and senior researcher, Institute of Fiscal Studies. But Kofi Ajay, my colleague here, data analyst, researcher, joins the conversation. He will set the tone for this conversation. Kofi, a very good morning to you.
Morning, Ben.
It's good to hear from you. For a moment, when I heard that beep, I was wondering whether you were in there. It's good to have you as always. Now, Kofi, we've settled our domestic debt exchange program, but externally, there remains a lot to be tackled so we can secure that IMF deal. What are some of the salient points we should be addressing, we should be looking at in this regard?
Well, it's true we've been able to do domestic debt restructuring, but currently the biggest hurdle to cross will be the external debt restructuring, because we have an external debt portfolio worth somewhere $29 billion, dollars. And if you look at the 2021 debt report and you try to study the data put out by the finance ministry, you realize that as a country, we pay close to $2.5 billion, dollars every year to our external creditors as loan service. And so you look at such a huge amount and then look at the kind of situation you find yourself in, the fact that you do not have the liquidity to do such loan servicing, then, it is very important for you to do something to make sure that you save yourself some dollars in 2023 so that you do not have to use the few that you have to settle loans. Now, if you want to restructure your external debts, then you have to look at the components of it as well. And if you look at the data available, majority of our debts sold to the Eurobond market, of which when we study the data, we realize that in the next 10 years, we'll be paying close to $8 billion dollars as principal payments. We're not even talking about interest payments on this $7 billion. So the country finds itself in a very dire situation as far as debt servicing at the international front is concerned. But the biggest elephant in the room here when you talk about debt restructuring is China. Because China is the only single country that has a debt burden on Ghana worth $1.7 billion. Even if you combine all Paris Club debts that we owe them, is just $1.9 billion. If you compare that to China, it tells you that we have a huge debt burden with China. They are our biggest bilateral, creditor on the international front. So restructuring of our debt means you need to get China to play ball, but we find ourselves in a very dire situation where China will probably only forgive you if the debts you are owing them is interest-free. And so we find templates across African countries where, for instance, Congo wanted to restructure a debt burden of $3 or $4 billion dollars. They reached out to China. They wanted, debt cancellation, and China was only willing to play ball so long as Congo agrees to extend the maturity period and then also increase the coupon rate or the interest rate. So instead of Congo's $1.4 billion debt, after the restructuring, they ended up with a debt burden of $1.6 6 billion. So China will only agree to play ball if you also agree to extend, the maturity period or also increase the interest payment. But forgiveness, if you look at Ghana's debt books and then how much we owe to China.
But just a quick point to clarify. So once you're extending the maturity period, what we've seen with China is that they would expect you to pay more over time. So let's say if it were 6 years and now it's going to be extended to about 8 or 9 years, you're going to end up paying more in terms of interest on the same debt, right?
Exactly. So just like we saw with Congo, so they ended up paying 1.6 billion instead of 1.4 billion, just like you rightly said. But on the screen now, we have about 4 steps to go through in terms of the negotiations. So far, we've been able to successfully do the first one, which is to announce the default. As for the negotiations, we've started. Most of the external creditors have given us the assurance, especially the Paris Club. But just like I said, the biggest elephant in the room is China. And China is holding about 1.7 billion of our debt. So it's so significant to make sure that we get China to come to the table to play ball as long as this debt negotiation restructuring is concerned. So if you look at the data, for instance, over the years, China, they do debt forgiveness, but it's just a fraction, a small fraction of the debt burden they have, the loans that they've actually given to country. So if you look at Ghana, for instance, over the past 2 decades, China has only forgiven us $208 million of our debt. But the monies we've taken from China, I think since 1996, is around $4 billion. That's the accumulated value of monies we've taken from China. Most of these loans we've taken from China are project loans. And so we usually use our minerals as collateral. So I am looking at the last loan that we took from China, for instance. It was on the Ghana Rural, the Telephone and Digital Inclusive Project. And the loan amount was 140 million euros. And then it was from the Exim Bank of China. So it was for communication. So usually when we take project loans from China, we use our minerals as collateral. So the Sino Hydro deal is a perfect example where we are using our bauxite as the collateral to get a $2 billion loan from China. But if you look at our books, we are owing China about 1.7 billion, cumulatively taken about 4.8 billion from China over the years. And most of it have been project loans and collateralized in our minerals.
Well, thank you, Kofi, for setting the tone for the conversation. We're going to be deliberating on exactly those points that you made, like Kofi Ajay, data analyst, researcher here at the Multimedia Group, made mention of. China is that big elephant in the room. If we're going to get our external debt, in a sort of good way so that we can proceed with an IMF deal, it would require China playing ball. But the question is, will they play ball? Will we give them enough reason to? Let's start with Professor Bokpin and the rest of the guests who are joining us via Zoom. Prof, a very good morning to you. All right, so we'll try to get some of the other guests. Do we have Dr. Idrisu, Dr. Saad Idrisu?
Hiya, good morning, Ben.
Good morning, Doc. I hope you're well.
Good.
It's good to have you connect with us this morning on the show. I'd like to find out from you. So the DDEP is out of the way. Not totally, though, because there are still problems like the payment of bonds, for which reason now March 13 has been tabled in terms of some of those payments that should have been made. But when it comes to our external debt, there's no way of moving forward without taking care of that. And we realize that we have to deal with our Eurobond partners, those who have been buying our debt, we have to look at China, which is the biggest single or the single biggest bilateral partner we have when it comes to this issue. And then we also have to look at the Paris Club. Where do you feel, where do you see that we are currently in this process?
Thank you again, Ben, and good morning to all your listeners. Hold on, I think I'm having a problem with my connection.
Okay.
Yes, good morning to you and good morning to all your listeners. Actually, following the discussions with China is something that shouldn't have happened, but unfortunately, Ghana finds itself in this
Dr. Idrisu, I would appreciate it if you could speak up a bit. I can barely hear you. Were you saying that the discussions with China or borrowing from China shouldn't have happened? I got lost there.
Well, I'm saying that whatever is happening in Ghana currently with regards to the DDEP, which was the domestic debt exchange program, as well as this external debt restructuring, it shouldn't have been happening. But unfortunately, Ghana finds itself in this particular situation, and we are forced to deal with China, whether they want to play ball or not. We will have no option than to actually work with them. Because if you look at all what is happening with regards to the DDEP and the external debt restructuring, it all points to a certain factor of government failure. Government failure in the sense that, I mean, there has been form of not following the fiscal discipline, which has resulted in overspending or which has resulted in a lot of mismanagement, contributing to this particular factor. But if a government is not able to manage its debts very well, then definitely you get into this, government failure situation we are finding ourselves in.
Now, if you look at what we've been presented with, our bilateral partners, our multilateral partners, the president recently, for example, was calling on the German, ambassador to Ghana to plead with China in terms of easing up on our debt, in terms of some debt forgiveness, if possible. You look at the domestic debt, 14.7 billion, like we've put in your short, and external debt, 29.2 billion. Now, we've dealt with the domestic debt, so to speak, but the external debt is just about twice, a little over twice the figure that we're looking at for the local debt. How much of a constraint do you feel this is going to be in terms of securing an IMF deal, especially when Mr. President is telling us that, look, by close of this month, we should have made quite a lot of progress in terms of securing an IMF program?
Well, I think it's quite good for listeners to actually get to appreciate the scenario we are currently in. If you look at the external debt of $29 billion, China, Ghana owes China about 40% of those debts. So China is one of our biggest external creditor that Ghana will have to deal with, which is 1.7 billion. So with that sort of situation, if China doesn't really participate that much or join the other creditors, then definitely we might kind of hit a wall in that regard. But if you look at China, China is part of the G20 country, but it's not part of the Paris Club members. So if you make a combination of all the other creditors who are willing to come on board, minus China, then in that case we are going to have a particular issue.
That would mean about half of what you're trying to deal with is not going to be available to you.
Refusing to participate in that agreement. And the main issue here is that if you take a look at the G20 framework, the G20 framework comes, the debt structure under the G20 common framework comes with certain rules, certain structures, which China may not be willing to follow under these circumstances. So if you look at the whole issue, it's like my understanding is that China is willing to deal with government of Ghana on a bilateral basis. So China to Ghana directly dealing one-on-one on its debts so that China could tell us what it will do with its debts instead of joining the other creditors on the table. So that is the options that we will be looking at. But if you look at this particular scenario, Ghana wouldn't be in in a very strong position to negotiate if it is just dealing directly on a bilateral level with China. Following what has happened in cases like Sri Lanka, where China had to come in and take over the Sri Lanka port,
Yeah, the port.
now 70% shares in that particular port. So that tells you that if you are going to deal directly with China as a country, you may end up losing some of your national assets. That is why it's good for China to come on board with the other creditors. Then there will be a general discussion on what debt relief structure to implement for Ghana.
Hold for me, Dr. Idrisu. Let me bring in Leslie Dwight Mensah as well. A very good morning to you, Leslie.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for joining the conversation. Leslie, by the way, is an economist, senior researcher at Institute for Fiscal Studies. When you look at our situation, some call it precarious. What do you see? The DDEP is out of the way, so to speak, but the external debt is an overhang right now. And China is that elephant in the room. How do you feel we should deal with this situation, especially considering that China has a certain track record? If you fail to meet your debt obligations, usually they are not very friendly with you. It's not that they've never granted debt relief or debt forgiveness, but they rarely do that. The best they usually do is to extend the period and you get to pay more. So what do you see as far as the G7 or the Paris Club is concerned, and then the broader umbrella, which includes China as well? What do you see?
Well, I should like to first make a number of key points. One, no creditor is obliged to forgive Ghana's.
Mr. Mensah, I would appreciate it if you could speak up a bit. I'm struggling to hear you.
Okay. I want to start by making a number of fundamental points. The first of which is that, are you able to hear me now?
I can hear you, sir.
Okay. So the first point is that no creditor is obliged to forgive Ghana's debt or to grant Ghana debt relief. The situation is that we have made requests for debt relief or debt renegotiation that are being considered. The second point is that creditors like to be treated equally or fairly in any debt renegotiation process. No creditor wants to be given the short end of the stick, as it were. This is the so-called pari passu principle, and it explains why the Paris Club members want to see China at the table. It does appear, though, that the Chinese want to negotiate with us outside the Paris Club framework. My own view is that they are entitled to demand that, and we must use the mechanism they prefer. Now, whether or not we will achieve a breakthrough with the Chinese or with any other class of creditors will depend to a large degree on the offer we put before them. As we saw with the domestic debt restructuring exercise, what moved the needle was the government's revised offers that minimized the losses that bondholders were going to suffer. So success essentially will hinge on the extent to which we make an offer that minimizes the losses on the Chinese side. This means, for example, if we are to get mere debt service deferment without net present value saving on the obligation from our bilateral creditors, we should be prepared to take it. Because as I explained from the beginning, no one is obliged to forgive our debt. The related point is that the more onerous aspect of our foreign debt service burden is the debt service expense on our Eurobonds. We need presently about $1 billion per annum to pay the interest alone on the Eurobond. The bilateral debt tends to be of shorter duration, so it is likelier that they have more principal payments coming due.
Right.
But that is something that we can address by asking for a debt service deferment, even if the Chinese or the Paris Club members refuse to grant us NPV, net present value savings. I think we should be prepared to take it.
Right. As some analysts or economic watchers have said, China is not bound, like you're saying. They can decide not to. I mean, you go for a loan and you must meet the loan requirements. That is it. But in this instance, we know that with the G20, there are clear guidelines, laid down structures for debt restructuring. China doesn't operate within this framework. What does that mean for us as we go and literally beg them for some debt forgiveness in this instance? What does it mean? I mean, what could be the consequences?
Okay, well, so as I said, the more worrisome, aspect of the foreign debt issue has to do with the debt service obligations on our commercial loans, in particular the Eurobonds. Now, it is possible at the end of this whole exercise with restructuring both our domestic and foreign debt to not meet our expectations for the debt service savings required to reach our medium-term fiscal goals as agreed with the IMF. The question then is, what should we then do? If we do not get generous enough debt service relief from our external creditors, particularly the bilateral creditors, what should we then do? First of all, my own view is that the target with the IMF to reduce the net present value of our public debt to 55% of GDP by 2028 should not be seen as cast in stone. The 55% ratio is not some magic number. It is something that can be adjusted to conform with the actual outcomes of the debt restructuring as we have conducted it. Now, second, we can offset any underattainment of our target for the debt restructuring through a stronger fiscal adjustment within the context of the government budget that we have presented, than we're currently envisaging. Our assessment at the Institute for Fiscal Studies of the 2023 budget is that in spite of the narrative, really no fiscal adjustment is going to take place in 2023, even though the budget projects to begin to consolidate the public finances from 2024. But we can't put much faith based on historical learning in the 2024 numbers, particularly when 2024 is an election year. So there's really room and need for the government to embark upon a more concrete traditional fiscal adjustment of revenue and expenditure this year and over the medium term,
right,
to offset any potential underachievement of our expectations with the debt restructuring. Because remember, we are carrying out two forms of fiscal retrenchment in parallel. We're going through the traditional, or we plan to go through the traditional fiscal adjustment of revenue and expenditure through the budget, and we are attempting a debt adjustment. Now, we need to get the balance right. If we're not getting enough of the savings we want on the debt restructuring side, it means that the traditional fiscal adjustment of revenue and expenditure would have to carry a heavier share of the burden.
Hold for me. Let me bring in Professor Bokpin of the University of Ghana Business School. Prof, a very good morning to you.
Yes, good morning. And good morning to my co-panelists and your listeners.
Right. Thank you so much
for
for
having me on your show.
thank you for joining us on the show. So it's quite a conundrum that we have to deal with. Debt servicing every year in terms of the payments is around $2.5 billion. But here we are, we want an IMF program. We need that stability. You look at our debt portfolio, 13.1 billion for the Euro bonds, but then with bilateral partners, China alone, about half of that, 1.7 billion. Then you look at the Paris Club, about 1.9 billion. But that isn't really where the problem is. Because if China doesn't come along, it appears we're going to be in dire straits. And like some experts have said, look, in this deal, the debt restructuring would be at China's behest. How they want it to go is how we will be compelled to let it go. It will be on their terms, not on our terms. How does that factor into the fact that we need this IMF program as quickly as possible? What is your reading on the China situation?
Well, thank you very much. I think that we are majoring on the minor.
We are?
Yeah. And my considered view is that this whole global geopolitics with Russia, China, a bit more India on one side, and then the West, particularly Paris Club creditors on the other hand, is playing out in Ghana's debt restructuring. And the reason I'm saying so is that there is some consciousness to make China look like a bad lender on the continent. And I think that is not fair on the part of, or which that view, that picture is not fair to be accommodated.
You're referring to debt diplomacy. Then, of course, we've always had it,
Yes.
and it has been said in the past that China is a bit opaque when it comes to its debt dealings and not as transparent as, for example, the G7 would be. We know they don't operate within the G20 framework when it comes to debt restructuring and all of that. Is it unfair then to look at China, especially on the back of things we've seen in Africa, in Sri Lanka, other places being seized and all of that? Is it that unfair to China?
Look, let's look at it from this perspective. That Paris Club creditors, non-Paris Club creditors, they are all on the continent for what they can get.
Agreed.
None of them is here solely for your interest. Now, if you examine the literature, whether it's China, whether it's France, US, UK, whatever, they've all used Africa as a stepping stone in their developmental process. Then China stepped in lately through debt and trade diplomacy. Now, at a time when Africa needed the West most, was actually when the West abandoned Africa.
And China filled the gap.
And then China stepped up to the plate. So China's developmental footprint on the continent in the last 20, 25 years is there for anyone and everyone to see. That is not to suggest that China is in here solely for our good. They are in here for their interests also. Unfortunately, it is only Africa that is in this with no clear strategy of what it wants from the rest of the world. Now, and the reason I'm saying so is that at a time when we needed a lot of developmental assistance, concessionary and the rest of them, the Paris Club creditors were organizing sending off parties for themselves. So if you look at the composition, bilateral, Paris Club creditors, all of them put together relative to China, do you see the balance?
Yes, it's about 200 million because China alone is 1.7 billion and all of them put together 1.9 billion.
So now, okay. So that should tell you that China has more to forgive compared to any other Paris Club creditor.
Is it not also because of our borrowing appetite and maybe to some extent our recklessness?
We can come to that. But we are saying that if you look at how China has stepped up in financing the the infrastructure deficit on the continent is huge. It's huge. Now, if you are looking at restructuring your debt, I'm saying that we are majoring on the minor. Why? What is the proportion of China's debt? Look at the expert from IFS spoke about Eurobond, commercial Eurobond component. So you should look at things in relative terms of importance. But I can understand that beyond just debt restructuring, we need assurance from our bilateral creditors or development partners that they will help Ghana to close the funding gap. The point that I'm making is that, hello?
Yes, sir, I'm listening to you.
What Ghana is looking for from our bilateral creditors and multilateral partners is more than just debt forgiveness. When the IMF reached staff level agreement with Ghana, they indicated certain prior actions that we needed to fulfill before the staff level agreement will go to the board. I think there were about 4 of them. 1, take steps to comprehensively restructure your debt. And then obtain assurance. You see that part? Obtain assurance from your development partners, creditors, bilateral, multilateral,
right,
that they will commit to closing the funding gap. I will explain that a bit further before I come with the other one. You know why that is important?
Why?
If you pick the 2023 budget and the outlook to 2023, as government had indicated, working under the inspirational framework of the fiscal adjustment process under the IMF program, has huge fiscal deficit the next 2, 3, 4 years. Now, that same country, so if you pick the 2023 alone, the deficit is over 30 billion cedis. And I agree with the earlier expert that if you look at the 2023 budget, the government is living as though it's harvest season with its expenditure. Right? We'll come to that before I finish. So with that deficit this year, next year, 2025, and the same country has lost market access from the Eurobond market. From the domestic market, the medium to the long-term end of the market, government has been priced out. So what it means is that merely approving the IMF program without assurance of funding to close that gap, the program can only achieve limited effectiveness. Now, that is just on one hand. On the other hand, IMF program itself, if you cost it, it will require more than what the IMF itself can provide in translating the program objectives into actual. So you actually need more than $3 billion in implementing the IMF program. So that is why the IMF will use its leverage to draw on their sister institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, and that is why they are asking for assurance from Ghana's bilateral and multilateral development partners that they will help to close the funding gap. So there's a funding gap that has to be closed. And because we cannot go to the Eurobond market and the medium to the long-term end of the market in the domestic financial market is closed, we need development partners to come on board. So the asking China to come on board goes beyond just the 1.7 billion.
Right.
Of course, we know that China typically doesn't do budgetary support. But given China's influence on the continent and the rest of them, it is then imperative that China is on board within a certain common framework of burden sharing at that level also. Right? That's where it's important. Then the other prior action that they announced was the audit and publication of COVID-19 expenditure. As I will said this before, that's how come it was released. Then there was also another which was utility adjustment. The framework was to ask for close to 60% electricity price adjustment, effective 1st February. That has also been done. Of course, they didn't get exactly the 60%, right? That has also been done. So these are prior actions that must be done before IMF board would approve the program. Otherwise, if they approve it under this financing constraint, the program can only achieve limited effectiveness. So that is the angle. Now, if you look at how much we owe China.
Prof, just to prompt that, there's a whole lot more we have to exhaust on this conversation. So briefly on this point, so we can move on to other points as well with the other guests. Just had to interject to make mention of that. Please go ahead, Prof.
Hello?
Yes, I can hear you. Please go ahead.
Yes. So what I'm saying is that we should be able to get an IMF program.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Whether China agrees to forgive us of their debt or not, the IMF should be able to give us a program. Because how much we owe China is not that material in the scheme of debt restructuring. But to the extent that we need further commitment in closing the funding gap and that building consensus is good, we should find a way of reaching out to China. And here, I will not blame China, but I would rather blame Ghana in its role currently in the diplomatic arena, the global diplomatic arena, we leaning more towards the West.
Are you speaking
that portrays us in a certain way to Russia and China and even India?
I was about to get to exactly that. For example, we spoke about the Burkina Faso situation,
yes,
and what our president said about the Wagner Group. Then in recent times, it had to do with that vote at the UN General Assembly and all of that. I mean, yes, some would say that means we're leaning more towards the West. But look, we're also speaking to the Russians. Let's face it, we're getting Russian oil in this country. Very recent scenes as well. So
remember that is that
going to affect the situation in any way?
Yeah, that is what I'm saying, that Ghana needed to have evaluated its strategy carefully. Okay, what is the strategy? What is it that is guiding our utterances and our position? What do we want? I'm sure what we wanted was to cut the West more. And so if you check right from the IMF managing director and a lot of the comment from the West has been to absorb Ghana's government from the current mess, that it was not Ghana. It was solely Russia, Ukraine. Check the comment of the IMF managing director.
No, I am fully aware. In fact, she had an interaction with me and said exactly that. COVID-19, Russo-Ukrainian war. That was what she told me.
But let me conclude by saying that in the midst of that narrative, it is clear, even to the diplomatic community, that Ghana is a spoiled child that needs to be disciplined and needs to be told the truth, that cut expenditure, be responsible. In other words, they are telling us, be responsible. You cannot continue to live your life anyhow and expect other people to use their balance sheet to sustain you. Because if you look at how much we owe China, with some level of expenditure cut, we could actually undo that. That is where the future is. The future does not lie in begging China begging US and the rest of them. The future lies in being responsible as a country that has gained independence for almost 66 years.
All right.
You have to be responsible.
Do hold for me, Prof. I mean, my takeaway from what you've said so far, Ghana is that spoiled child that needs discipline. Ghana is that spoiled child that needs discipline, and we need to be more responsible in managing finances. But let me come to Dr. Idrisu. So, based on the discussions we've had so far, you would realize that the German ambassador hinted recently in that discourse, a rare one, by the way, that, look, the Paris Club is not going to give Ghana relief from debt if it will be used to service China's debt. Prof has said that those ones focusing on China is a bit of a minor issue. But how do you feel this specific bit will not give you relief if you're going to use the debt to pay China? So we have the West and the East on one end, and China is a big figure. What's your reaction to that?
Well, that is very true. If you look at the geopolitics that is happening around our debts in particular, you realize that the Russia, China, US geopolitics is actually playing a role here. But I do believe Ghana still have a bit of options in here, in the sense that if China refuses to join voluntarily and wants to meet Ghana on the bilateral level, then our government should try and see if there could be any negotiations and see the outcome of such negotiations. I mean, even though we've had instances of Sri Lanka and other countries where China seems to have freeze their assets as collateral for loans. But if they still go ahead with those negotiations, we could get something good out of that. The other option is also for China to voluntarily join the other creditors, which is the Paris Club. Then collectively, they could come out with a better debt structure for the particular scenario. But again, whether China participates or doesn't participate at all, I still believe that the IMF can go ahead and still grant Ghana this particular bailout that Ghana is looking for. Because if China doesn't participate, China will be the only creditor that is not responding. And looking at what government has done domestically with regards to the DDEP, and also if government is able to get those financial assurances, even from other developmental partners and not just China, I still believe the IMF should be able to do something if it really wants to. But again, if you
when you say do something,
saying,
if it really wants to, what do you mean? Still give Ghana go ahead with a program for Ghana?
Yes, the IMF could still go ahead and approve the program for Ghana, even without China's participation. I mean, let's be realistic. It's the board makes the decision. Some of these things are just international politics playing a role. They don't need China to participate before they could grant Ghana an IMF bailout. Let's be realistic on that point. It's just sometimes the international politics do come.
But technically, realistically, the West wouldn't want to participate and be making concessions when China is still going to be getting its debt servicing at the same levels. You do realize
the debt servicing, China is not saying that it will get the debt servicing at the same level. China is only, based on the understanding I'm having, China only wants to negotiate outside the G20 debt framework. So in that case, China will be dealing directly with Ghana on that debt restructuring level. And again, there could be an instance whereby China could probably give us an extension of our due dates, which will still, our maturity due date, which will still be good for Ghana. Then,
we'll likely end up paying more.
Cancel out our loans per se, because even though China is known, it's not really something that they do over the years. If China is about to cancel your loans, probably maybe you are left with some few balance to pay off, then maybe they will end up canceling. But if you are owed so much, you don't just expect total cancellation of the debts. But at least they could grant us an extension of the maturity due dates, and that will still be good for Ghana in this particular case. And I'm emphatically stating it that the IMF can still go ahead and approve this 3 billion funding for Ghana, even without China's participation. These are all geopolitical stuff happening within our debt situation.
All
Because
right.
if you take the other Paris Club, the other multilateral agencies and all that, they are all more or less from the West. You get it. And I'll come to the reason why China is probably also not deciding to participate in this particular regard. With regards to what you were just talking about, unfortunately, our government, or let me just say the president, sometimes speaks as if, a man who is about to orgasm. You understand? When it comes to international politics or geopolitics, you have to play your ball well to such that you don't step on a lineman. If you look at what started in April 2022, when government communicators were all over blaming Russia for Ghana's economic woes, all radio stations, all TV stations, government communicators were blaming Russia for starting the war in Ukraine. So it forced the Russian embassy in Accra to respond to the government in April through a Twitter post and all that. So it's like you started some form of diplomatic rift between you and Russia. Then if you go back to what happened in December 2022 again, with the president making allegations of the Russian mercenaries and all that, you realize that Moscow came out vehemently and denied any association with the Wagner group and stuff like that. So if you keep doing this, you are creating some diplomatic rift between you and Russia. And you know China and Russia are allies. So when you do that, it's like if you offend my friend and you come to me, you don't expect me to just give you an open arms. We've had President Rawlings. He played the geopolitics very well. He never stepped on the toes of Russia or America or China. We've had President Mills. He did the same thing. We've had President Kufuor. He did the same thing. We've had President Mahama. He did the same thing. As a president, there are certain things you just don't say publicly. Even no matter how you feel you want to say, you must be guided, because whatever you say publicly will actually have a political effect on your economy. And that is why, that is the case we are facing right now.
So you're saying that in terms of managing that geopolitical fine line, that fine rope, President Akufo-Addo has not done what his predecessors have done.
He hasn't done what is expected of a president in managing the geopolitical line. Because everyone knows that these three nations, China, Russia, America, are the superpowers of the world. You don't want to pick sides. Even if you are picking sides, pick it in your heart, pick it in your bedroom, pick it in your cabinet meetings, but don't go to Washington, don't go public places to pick sides. And that's why I gave you examples of former President Rawlings was able to play it, Atta Mills, Kufuor, John Mahama, they all knew about the thin line that happened. It's like a landmine. If you step wrongly, it's just going to blast you. And that is the situation we are facing now.
Right. Let me bring in Leslie Mensah into the conversation as well. As we wrap on China, I want us to get into other things, but to conclude on the Chinese element in all of this, do you feel we have done ourselves a bit of a disservice by relying too much on Chinese loans, much like what other countries in Africa have done? But if China decides to play hardball and say, we're sticking to our guns, we're not going according to the G20 rules of debt restructuring, we're going to deal with you on a bilateral level, Ghana, China, or China, Ghana, in which case we are likely going to get a far less good deal, would you say that would be burning our fingers and moving forward we should learn lessons? What do you think, vis-a-vis what is happening with the Western countries or the G7? Hello, Leslie.
Yes. I'm saying that we ought to learn lessons from the entire debacle, this entire crisis we're in. And the disservice we have done ourselves is really to build up debt beyond our capacity to pay. My own contention is that the Chinese credit lines often tend to be more flexible and in fact give us greater control over the use of the funds. So So the Chinese credit lines do have some advantages over the traditional, support and credit lines we have received from the Western partners. But the point I'll make, to end this part of the discussion is that, look, it is Ghana that needs the IMF program so badly. It is Ghana that needs the budgetary commitment of our partners so badly. And we're involved in this operation to achieve a number of things. One, we aim to begin to rebuild our public finances in order to stabilize the macroeconomy. Now, second, we also need to address a hard currency crunch that has been enduring since 2022. We simply do not have enough foreign exchange to pay our bills and to service our debt. This explains why we announced the suspension of our external debt service payment. And securing the fund program, as well as the budgetary funding commitments of our partners, will unlock new foreign exchange inflows to ameliorate that situation. And you'll observe that the exchange rate has sort of been hanging in there, waiting to see the direction in which all these things will go. The third point, which really adds to the point Professor Bokpin made, is that we need to secure financing for the budget because we do not have definite or confirmed funding for some of the expenditures in the 2023 budget. And accounting on the program, the budgetary support assurances we'll get from our partners to unlock funding. In fact, from what I see in the budget, about 64 billion cedis of the expenditures in the 2023 budget do not have any definite or confirmed funding. So we really need to conclude this operation, the restructuring of the debt, the agreement of the fund program, the procurement of the financing assurances from our partners quite rapidly so that we can bring some certainty to the public finance situation and to the macroeconomic outlook.
Let me bring in Professor Bokpin once more. So, looking at where we find ourselves, you were speaking a short while ago in my earlier interaction with you. You referred to Ghana as that spoiled child needing discipline. The German ambassador to Ghana recently has spoken of the fact that if we're going to engage in this debt restructuring and all of that, we should also look at budgetary cuts. And he makes the allusion that, look, my country has fewer ministers than you do in your country. In fact, what he was basically saying was, you're a small country, you don't have an economy like mine. My country borrows to your country, yet you spend so much in certain areas that could easily be cut off. What is your reaction on that point as we get forward to, gear up to wind on that conversation? Briefly, Professor Bokpin.
I was of the view a couple of months ago that we were going to get to this point where the diplomatic community, even if they were speaking to government in private to do something about the size and the expenditure, they will come openly. Because what Ghana should know is that there's likely to be donor fatigue somewhere along the line.
Are we not there already?
We are almost there. We are almost there. And that is why, you see, when it gets to the point where diplomats begin to speak openly like this, then it tells you a lot has been going on behind the scenes. Discussions among themselves. And all of us must support that call because that is where our future lies. If you look at the global landscape, there are challenges in the U.S. they themselves have to fix. UK has challenges. Germany has challenges. So if you look at the last 25 years, these Paris Club creditors have been actually winding off in terms of their developmental assistance. You check the data. So that tells you that there is no way you can look forward to this channel of support consistently. And as a country, we must be responsible. That is where the solution is. Look, let's encourage Ghana to be responsible and pay its debt. It comes with some level of integrity, right? This country must have a certain minimum level of pride as a country, as a pride that resides in our sovereignty, Ghana. We must. It serves us no good overall to be looking, begging consistently. It dwarfs businesses that operate from here. It dwarfs the net wealth of our financial institutions as they interact with the outside world through correspondent banking, credit lines, and all of that. You see, what you gain by being responsible and the respect that you get and the competitive trading arrangement and investment you're able to secure because you are responsible far outweigh what you gain by being irresponsible and begging for debt forgiveness day in, day out.
Right.
No. China, 1.7 billion, we could actually cut expenditure, and that will not hurt growth, and we'll be able to pay off China. We must be responsible.
Right.
We must. The future, look, the best helping hand we can find is at the end of our own arm. It will not even come from the IMF.
Right.
The 17th IMF program will not solve Ghana's problems sustainably. It will not.
Okay.
If we don't decide, and what we are saying here, hello,
I'm listening.
the point
Prof.
that we are making here is not because this government is in power. No government in the next 40 years should have more than 40 ministers. If any government cannot govern with less than 40 ministers, they should leave and give the opportunity to those who can do it.
Okay.
Let's sanitize our public finance. We have created a reward incentive mechanism that rewards laziness through politics. And the real sector suffers because people don't want to go to the real sector where you need to work hard and have the kind of lifestyle you want to have. People want to load their lifestyle on the public purse. This is not sustainable.
Right.
Let's encourage our president to rise up to the occasion. Look, we all believed in Nana. In 2016, Nana can do it. Nana should rise up to the occasion, should do that, and that will rally support and confidence behind him and the economy. And the impact of that will be more than China canceling $1.7 billion. They can cancel all of that, and in less than 2 years, we'll get back to the same point.
Point made. Interesting point. Professor Buckman, we're going to have to hang up the conversation here. Thank you so much for having joined the conversation. Professor Godfred Buckman is a lecturer at the University of Ghana, specifically the University of Ghana Business School. I'll come to you, Leslie, in just about a minute. What are your expectations in all of this? We will be going to China to seek some relief, so to speak, in terms of our debt. What are your expectations? And in terms of an IMF program, what are your expectations in terms of that as well? That question for both you and Dr. Idrisu, but I'll start with you, Leslie.
I'd say that we should take whatever we get, through these negotiations. And let me correct a point that you made earlier. If the Chinese agree simply to defer the repayment of our obligations and require that we pay interest on the deferred portion of the debt, that would not necessarily amount to paying more in net present value terms. Okay? Even though in cash terms, you may be paying more overall to the Chinese,
which is the point I was making, by the way.
Value terms, you would not necessarily be paying more. Then the final point really is to say that, look, the government needs to get its priorities right. Okay? It's fine to have nice ambitions and to want to spend public money to support the economy, to grow the economy. But the big question is, what do you need to do now to address the crisis we're in? And the answer really, fundamentally, is to have restrained fiscal policy rather than to hold on to your spending intentions. Doing that would mean misplacing your priorities.
Leslie, thank you so much for having joined the conversation. Leslie Dwight-Mensah is an economist and senior researcher with the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Let's cap off the conversation with Dr. Saad Idrisu. Dr. Idrisu, what are your final thoughts?
Well, my final thoughts are that whatever be the case, unless the IMF should look Ghana's way and give Ghana the approval that it deserves with regards to the board level approval. But there's something interesting that I really want, Ben, to draw your attention to and the attention of your listeners and the entire country. Ghana in particular, we borrow to waste and not to develop. And until we fix this particular issue, no matter how much the country borrows, there wouldn't be any meaningful development that will come out of it. It doesn't matter which government is in power. And why do I say this? Ben, let's go back to President Rawlings' era. Whatever monies that were borrowed and some projects started, up to now, go around the country, you will find abandoned projects from Rawlings' era. Come to Kufuor's era, monies that were borrowed and projects were started with those funds. Some of them are still uncompleted. Ghana is paying those loans plus the interest, but we are not getting the economic return from the projects. Same way, if you come under Mills, under Rawlings, under JM, and under Nanado, look at the Segleme housing. Monies were borrowed to start it. Right now, it is rotten. We are not getting the economic value of the borrowing that was being done. Look at the E-blocks that were started. Monies were borrowed to start it. But we are not getting the economic returns from that borrowing. So we have a country whereby we just have an appetite for borrowing, just for borrowing's sake. But at the end of the day, any new government that comes into power will abandon all the projects that were started with these borrowed funds.
Right.
So where are we going as a nation if Parliament cannot come out to pass a law that will compel any successive government to continue the projects of its predecessors? Because the funds that were borrowed to start those projects are on behalf of Ghana, not the president in particular.
Right. We have
so
to.
That is where we really need to focus on if we want to move ahead as a responsible nation.
Dr. Idrisu, grateful as always for your time. And our speakers have left us with a lot to think about. Professor Bokpin, for example, saying we're like a spoiled child and we need discipline in terms of tightening the financial belt. And he also says no government moving on should have more than 40 ministers. And that, I mean, if you can't do with that, then you might as well step aside. A lot of thoughts that have been shared here on this bit, but we'll see how things pan out, especially from our engagements with the Chinese. But stay with us on the AM show. Up next, we've got AM Business, courtesy of EcoBank, the Pan-African Bank. Today, my colleague James Ashen interacts with former Chief Executive Officer of the Minerals Commission, Dr. Tony Obin, on how Ghana can leverage the discovery of lithium for economic growth. Up next on the AM show. Do stay.